Across the Border, Pathans and the Biloch by Edward E. Oliver in year 1884. Chapter 8. The Powindah and the Pat, an introduction and modern perspective on Edward E. Oliver's account of Dera Ismail Khan, the Daman, and the Sulaiman frontier. Edward E. Oliver's 8th chapter, The Powindah and the Pat, is much more than a description of an apparently barren landscape. Beneath its account of plains, mountains, passes, caravans, camels, and tribal communities lies a portrait of an entire frontier world, a world in which Dera Ismail Khan stood between the settled plains of British India and the mountains leading towards Afghanistan and Central Asia. Written in the 19th century, Oliver's account inevitably reflects the vocabulary and assumptions of British imperial observers of the period. Terms such as savage, lawless, civilized, and barbarian belong to the political and cultural language of colonial frontier writing. Such expressions should therefore be understood as part of the historical perspective of the author rather than accepted as neutral descriptions. Yet beneath that language is an extraordinarily detailed observation of geography, commerce, migration, and tribal society. The chapter begins with the Pat, the immense level plain stretching between the Indus and the Sulaiman Mountains. Oliver presents it as a landscape of extraordinary uniformity, flat, dry, almost treeless, and covered mainly with camel thorn and small, hardy plants. Rain transforms this apparently solid plain into deep mud, while sudden torrents descending from the mountains cut channels into the clay. The result is a landscape that is simultaneously dry and vulnerable to water. For much of the year, the Pat can appear almost lifeless. When rain comes, however, the same apparently barren surface is rapidly carved by running water. Deep ravines and channels intersect the plain, while tamarisk sometimes grows along their bottoms. This geographical description is important because the Pat was not an empty wilderness. It was an economic and ecological zone shaped by seasonal movement, irrigation, cultivation, and grazing. Where water could be controlled, artificial irrigation created small green oases. Oliver contrasts these cultivated patches with the overwhelmingly dry character of the surrounding country. The contrast between barren plain and irrigated settlement was one of the defining features of the Daman. In the northwestern part of this landscape stood Tank, which Oliver remembers for its gardens and fruit trees. The contrast between the town's cultivated gardens and the surrounding arid plain illustrates how strongly human settlement depended upon the management of water. Other settlements also had particular reputations. Daman, described as the town of the closed pass, was associated with an exceptionally fine mango tree, whose fruit was reportedly sent to Lahore during the time of Ranjit Singh. Kulachi, meanwhile, was celebrated in a local saying for its soldiers and its melons. These details may appear incidental, but they reveal an important feature of the Daman. Even within a harsh environment, particular settlements developed distinctive agricultural and commercial identities. The Sulaiman Mountains. To the west of the Pat stood the Sulaiman Mountains, appearing to Oliver as a long and relatively straight barrier with Takhti Sulaiman as its central landmark. To the north were the stony spurs of the Bitani or Shaikhbuddin range, together with the Ratako and Nilako. These ranges formed another barrier towards Banu and Marwat. The geography explains the strategic importance of Dera Ismail Khan. The plain was situated between two worlds, the Indus and the settled agricultural country to the east, and the mountain valleys and Afghan frontier to the west. The mountains, therefore, did not merely obstruct movement. Their passes determined where movement could take place. Oliver identifies several principal routes through the western barrier, including Vahoa Sheikh Haidar, or Zau Gumal Tank Zam Shuza. He also refers to numerous lesser passes crossing the outer ranges. These routes formed the arteries through which people, animals, armies, and merchandise moved between the Daman and the territories beyond the Sulaimans. Among them, however, one route stands above the rest. It is the Gumal Pass. The Gumal, a highway between worlds. For Oliver, the Gumal was not simply another mountain pass. It was one of the great commercial routes connecting Afghanistan and the Indian subcontinent. For centuries, traders descended through the Gumal during the cold season, with caravans loaded with merchandise from Afghanistan and Central Asia. They dispersed into the markets of India, selling their goods and purchasing commodities to carry back towards the Afghan and Central Asian highlands. The seasonal rhythm was therefore fundamental. The merchants descended from the mountains during the cooler months and returned towards the highlands as the summer approached. The Gumal consequently created a recurring cycle of movement between two geographical environments: the highlands of Afghanistan and Central Asia, and the plains of the Indus. This was not merely a commercial connection, it was also a human connection. The people who travelled through the Gumal were themselves part of a trans-frontier society whose relationships extended across the mountains. The modern political frontier can make the Sulaimans appear to be a dividing line between two countries. Oliver's account demonstrates that, historically, the mountains could function just as much as a corridor. The Powindah. At the centre of the chapter stands the Powindah. The word referred collectively to the migratory Afghan communities engaged in the long-distance carrying and trading business between Afghanistan, Central Asia, and India. The Powindah was not simply a merchant who travelled occasionally. The entire social organisation of these communities was adapted to movement. Families, livestock, camels, merchandise, and armed men travelled together. Large caravans could contain thousands of people and enormous numbers of animals. The caravan was therefore simultaneously a commercial enterprise, pastoral community, and armed expedition. The Powindah had to be capable of defending his goods and animals, because the journey crossed territories where relations between different tribal communities could be unstable. Oliver emphasises the physical qualities of the Powindahs: their stature, strength, and endurance. He also records descriptions of their rough clothing, weather-beaten appearance, and formidable manner. But behind Oliver's colourful description is a more significant historical fact. The Powindah represented a highly specialised mobile commercial society. The survival of the caravan depended upon knowledge of routes, seasons, grazing grounds, markets, and political relationships. A successful Powindah, therefore, required much more than physical strength. He needed commercial knowledge, geographical knowledge, and the ability to negotiate, and, when negotiation failed, the ability to defend the caravan. The scale of seasonal migration. Oliver's numerical observations give an extraordinary sense of the scale of this movement. He records that tens of thousands of Powindahs entered the Dera Ismail Khan district during the winter season. In 1 year, he gives a figure exceeding 76,000 persons. In another year, the figure was approximately 58,000, and another enumeration recorded about 50,000. These migrants did not arrive alone. The caravans were accompanied by enormous numbers of animals. Oliver records tens of thousands of camels and hundreds of thousands of sheep and goats. Such numbers fundamentally alter the understanding of the Pat. The landscape was not simply a desert through which occasional travellers passed. During the cold season, it became a vast seasonal pasture and commercial staging ground. The arrival of the Powindahs transformed the economic life of the region. The Daman was connected to a commercial system extending far beyond its immediate settlements. 3 kinds of Powindah life. Oliver identifies different forms of Powindah existence. The first consisted of the great kafilas, or caravans, which travelled long distances carrying merchandise. Some travelled as far as Amritsar, Delhi, Benares, and even Patna. This demonstrates the extraordinary geographical reach of the trade. The second group maintained fixed seasonal camps known as kiris. These camps allowed part of the community to remain in the Dera Ismail Khan region, while other members travelled onward to conduct trade. The third group consisted of the Chara folk, poorer migrants who came primarily in search of employment. They worked at physically demanding occupations such as road construction, stone breaking, and other forms of manual labour. Their lives were considerably harder than those of the wealthy merchants. They earned money in the plains and attempted to take their savings back to Afghanistan. Thus, the word Powindah encompassed people occupying very different economic positions. There were wealthy merchants, pastoralists, carriers, labourers, and people whose lives combined several of these activities. The tribes of the Powindah world. Oliver then turns to the various tribes associated with this commercial system. Among the most important were the Nassars, Karotis, Sulaiman Kels, Mian Kels, Dautanis, Niazais, Tokis, Tarakis, Andars, and Daulatsais. The Nassars were divided according to their principal means of livelihood into camel folk, ox and ass folk, and sheep folk. The camel folk were particularly important carriers and owned enormous numbers of camels. The sheep folk followed a different seasonal rhythm, bringing their flocks down to the plains in October and returning towards the mountains in spring. The Karotis were primarily associated with labour and carrying and had suffered economically from a prolonged feud with the Sulaiman Kels. The Sulaiman Kels, by contrast, were described as one of the largest and most powerful groups within the Powindah system. Their territory extended across a considerable portion of the Afghan highlands. Their behaviour inside British territory could be peaceful and commercially productive, while Oliver describes their reputation in their own country in considerably harsher terms. This contrast is significant. It demonstrates how the behaviour of a community could change according to the political and economic environment in which it operated. The Mian Kels and Daman. Among all these references, one of the most historically interesting concerns the Mian Kels. Oliver describes them as among the wealthiest of the Powindahs. Their summer territory lay in the region of Panna and Caravan, east of Ghazni, while they were closely connected with Mian Kels permanently settled in the Dera Ismail Khan country at Daman and Musazai. This passage is particularly revealing because it demonstrates that settlement in the Daman did not necessarily mean the complete abandonment of the older trans-mountain way of life. Oliver observes that some of the settled Mian Kels continued to participate in long-distance trade. A prosperous landowner could travel to Kabul or Bukhara, while a trading associate from Ghazni could acquire an estate on the British side of the mountains. The relationship, therefore, worked in both directions. The frontier was economically porous. People could have agricultural property on one side and commercial interests on the other. Family, tribal, and commercial relationships could extend across the mountains. The Mian Kel example illustrates the broader theme of the chapter. The Sulaiman frontier was a zone of interaction rather than an absolute division. The trade of Afghanistan and Central Asia. The merchandise carried through this system was varied. Oliver identifies imports including fruit, madder, silk, wool, sheepskin coats, drugs, and other products from Afghanistan and Central Asia. The return trade included indigo, cotton goods, tea, and other commodities from the Indian markets. The principal commercial centres beyond the frontier included Bokhara, Kabul, Kandahar, and Ghazni. On the British side, important centres included Dera Ismail Khan, Tank, and Kulachi, with Laya and Bakka on the eastern side of the Indus. This network gives a completely different meaning to Dera Ismail Khan's geographical position. The city was not simply a provincial centre at the edge of British India. It was a node within a much larger commercial geography extending from the Indus to Afghanistan and Central Asia. The economics of the frontier. Oliver's estimates of the trade suggest a substantial commercial economy. He cites earlier estimates of several million rupees and suggests that the actual volume may have been considerably greater. The figures themselves should be treated cautiously because 19th century colonial trade statistics were not necessarily comprehensive. Nevertheless, their scale indicates that the movement through the frontier was economically significant. The trade involved many different levels of society. A wealthy merchant could profit from long-distance commerce. A caravan owner could make money through transportation. A pastoralist could use the winter grazing grounds of the Daman. A labourer could earn wages in the plains. A settled landowner could maintain commercial connections with relatives and associates beyond the mountains. The frontier economy was therefore interdependent. Commerce and conflict. Yet this commercial world was never entirely peaceful. The Powindah caravan had to pass through tribal territories, and the relationship between traders and tribes could involve payments, negotiation, protection, and conflict. Oliver gives particular attention to the Waziris, whom he describes as persistent enemies of the caravans. He portrays the journey through Waziri territory as dangerous, with attacks on stragglers, theft of livestock and occasional larger engagements. From the British perspective, such activity appeared as highway robbery. From the perspective of tribal society, however, the relationship could be understood through the older political economy of the frontier: territorial rights, protection, tribute, grazing, and compensation. This distinction is important when reading 19th century frontier literature. Oliver was not writing an anthropological study from a neutral position. He was writing within the administrative and military world of British India, where the safety of trade routes and the control of frontier tribes were matters of strategic importance. Consequently, the language of the chapter reflects the imperial concern with bringing the frontier under greater political control. The railway and the future of the trade. The final part of the chapter looks towards the future. Oliver considers what effect the expansion of the railway might have upon the old caravan trade. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the chapter, because it places the traditional Powindah economy at the threshold of technological transformation. For centuries, caravans had connected Afghanistan and India. Now, railways were beginning to reach deeper into the commercial geography of the region. The railway represented more than a new form of transportation. It represented a new economic order. The old caravan system depended upon camels, mountain passes, seasonal migration and tribal negotiation. The emerging colonial system depended increasingly upon railways, roads, administrative posts, military protection and regulated trade. Oliver believed that improved communications and greater security could dramatically expand frontier commerce. In retrospect, this passage captures a moment when an ancient Trans-Asian commercial system was beginning to encounter the infrastructure of the modern industrial age. The larger historical meaning. Read from a modern perspective, the Powindah and the Pat is essentially a chapter about connectivity. The Pat connects the Indus plains with the Sulaiman foothills. The passes connect the Daman with the mountain valleys. The Gumal connects Dera Ismail Khan with Afghanistan. The caravans connect Afghanistan and Central Asia with the markets of India. And the tribal networks connect communities living on opposite sides of the mountains. The modern political boundary can obscure these older connections. The 19th century landscape described by Oliver was not divided into the neat national territories familiar today. It was a landscape of overlapping spheres of influence, tribal territories, seasonal migration routes, commercial networks, and political jurisdictions. The Sulaiman Mountains were therefore simultaneously a frontier and a bridge. Dera Ismail Khan as a frontier crossroads. One of the strongest impressions left by the chapter is the importance of Dera Ismail Khan as a crossroads. The district stood at the meeting point of several geographical systems: the Indus Valley, the Daman, the Sulaiman Mountains, the Gumal Corridor, Afghanistan, and the wider commercial world of Central Asia. Its apparent remoteness was therefore deceptive. A traveller standing on the Pat might see little more than an immense plain and a distant mountain wall. But behind those mountains lay Ghazni, Kandahar, and Kabul. Beyond them lay Central Asia. And moving between these regions were caravans carrying commodities, families, livestock, and information. The barren landscape was therefore the surface of a much larger historical system. A landscape of movement. Oliver's description also demonstrates why the history of this region cannot be understood solely through the history of its towns. The landscape itself determined human behaviour. The absence of abundant water encouraged seasonal migration. The mountains concentrated movement into particular passes. The availability of winter grazing attracted pastoral communities towards the Daman. The markets of India attracted Afghan merchants. The security or insecurity of the passes influenced the cost and direction of trade. The arrival of railways threatened to transform the entire system. Geography, economy, and politics were consequently inseparable. The historical significance of Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is valuable today for at least 4 reasons. First, it provides a detailed 19th century description of the physical geography of the Daman and Sulaiman frontier. Second, it records the scale and organisation of the Powindah migration and caravan trade. Third, it preserves information about the tribal and settlement geography of the frontier, including communities whose members lived on both sides of the mountains. Fourth, it provides evidence for understanding Dera Ismail Khan as part of an international commercial corridor long before the modern infrastructure of roads, railways, and national borders. The chapter, therefore, belongs not merely to the history of British India, it belongs to the larger history of Afghanistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Indus Valley, and Central Asian commerce. Before the original text, the world described by Oliver has largely disappeared. The camel caravan is no longer the dominant means of transporting Central Asian merchandise into the Indian plains. The railway and the motor road replaced much of the old caravan economy. The international boundary became progressively more significant. Administrative districts replaced many older forms of political organisation, yet the geographical foundations remain. The Pat remains between the Indus and the Sulaimans. The Sulaiman range still dominates the western horizon. The Gumal still cuts through the mountains, and the names of settlements and communities recorded by Oliver remain embedded in the historical geography of the region. Chapter 8 therefore offers a glimpse into a transitional moment, an ancient frontier economy still functioning according to its traditional rhythms, but already being observed, measured and reorganised by the expanding machinery of the British Empire. It is a portrait of a world between 2 ages, the age of the caravan and the coming age of the railway, the age of porous tribal frontiers and the coming age of increasingly formalised borders, the age of seasonal migration and the emerging age of permanent administration. Against this background, Edward E. Oliver's The Powindah and the Pat can be read not simply as an account of a barren plain and a wandering people, but as a record of one of the great historical corridors connecting the Indus world with Afghanistan and Central Asia.